It is really an honor to be sitting beside Steve. I had not met him until about a month ago, shortly after Rich had sent me an email asking if I wanted to be involved in this. And I don't have a cottage, I don't go up there any longer, so I wasn't familiar with the Freeland Film Festival. But I am now. We met and had breakfast, the three of us, and I was instantly blown away by the situation that we are facing right now in the world, and by all the work that Steve and Freeland have been doing for many, many years. And I like to think of myself as somebody who's fairly well-informed, generally, but I have to say I was staggered, just staggered, at the scope of this enormous problem. Give us a sense, the scope, the numbers, the money involved in what is going on now.
Check, check. Okay. With wildlife and human trafficking?
Both.
Okay.
Let's start with wildlife, though.
Okay. Well, we're going through the fastest rate of species loss ever. That's, the UN report said that recently, and that's just making the world hotter, faster. $25 billion a year in wildlife trade, and that doesn't...
$25 billion a year in wildlife trade.
Yeah, and technically it's much bigger because that does not include like all the illegal timber trafficking and fisheries. So it's anybody's guess, but they say that could be up to 175 billion if you put all that together. Human trafficking, we have more slaves in the world today than we ever have before. 41 to 43 million. Supposedly last year they rescued about 66,000 of those victims. So that's just, I think we talked about that today over at Colleen's class, and I think that's less than it's 0.1% or something. So that's the response. Yeah, but the numbers are staggering.
Where would you say ground zero is when we're talking about wildlife trafficking?
It's all over the place. People tend to think that the trail leads sort of exclusively to Asia and to China. China's definitely, I think, the #1 importer, illegal and legal, of wildlife in the world. But the United States is #2.
#2?
Yeah. I was just talking with folks at the table before who have visited this really interesting place that everybody should go to or watch a TV show about if you can't. It's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Wildlife Repository of all the confiscations. It's like Raiders of the Lost Ark. You go in there, it's like 1 million items or more of all kinds of things that you wouldn't think
like what
are
kinds
being imported.
what kinds of things?
Everything. Tiger skins, rhino horn, pangolin skins, and coats and boots made out of this, that, and the other. And the United States is the second biggest importer of wildlife in the world. Basically, the trade follows the money. So. But it's everywhere.
The article that just came out today, it's a fabulous article. It's talking about the rhino horn trade. Talk a little bit about that. One of the numbers that I found, again, staggering, was that, and I think these numbers are current, every day, 3 rhinos are killed every day?
Yeah.
Every day.
Yep, 3 rhinos killed every day.
I just can't even wrap my mind around that.
Well, and there's probably, what is it now, 1 elephant every 30 to 40 minutes. So that's, yeah.
And it's for the tusks, for the horns. Why? Why? Why in 2019? Why?
Yeah, so I think the reason GQ focused on that story, we were following rhino horn traffickers because inevitably people trafficking in rhino horn are probably trafficking in lots of other things, no matter where they're based. This happened to be Vietnamese organized crime. And they were going after horn because it cost $65,000 a kilo on the black market. And one horn can be, 3 kilos. Most rhino species will have 2 horns, so you might get $250,000 from one dead rhino. And those same syndicates would be, behind the killing of the elephants, the tigers, the lions. And by the way, they would have gangsters on the ground in Texas and LA and other places buying up rhino horns from safari hunts from Americans to add to their stash. And while they're here, looking at American bears and seeing if they can't get in on that action too. So it's a global trade.
There are issues with the rhino horns, with the elephants, with turtles. What other things do we need to be aware of that are happening that you wouldn't even think, you can't even imagine is happening?
I'm glad you brought up turtles, because a lot of people do focus on the mega fauna, and turtles are being hammered. I mean, for their shells, also for their meat, also as pets. So the demand for that comes from all over the world again. Eating turtles, the consumption there is mainly on the Asian side. But I don't think any turtle species anywhere in the world are safe for very long until we deal with that.
So getting a little tortoise or a turtle as a pet, bad idea.
Look, it's tough because there are legitimate captive breeding operations.
Okay.
There are. And there's people who operate those who are real animal lovers, and they take great care of them. You just, I think it's wise just to look really hard. If you're not sure, don't buy. If you are sure and it's a captive breeding facility, then that's a different story.
One of the stories I read about involved a tiger zoo in China. What can you tell us about that tiger zoo in China?
Well, there's a bunch, but there's one that we went to and investigate. They had 1,000 tigers in one zoo. 400 bears, 1,000 tigers. And, you don't need 1,000 tigers at a zoo. So, they would do several things. Everybody go around, look at massive amounts of tigers and take pictures of them. You could also buy tiger meat in the restaurant, and then maybe tiger bone wine, which would be made off the premise in a distillery. And then there was a show where you could go, and it was like Gladiator. You'd stand above on a kind of a plank up here, and there'd be a tiger out in the field, and then and everybody would gather, and the speaker would say, okay, and here's, we're going to watch tigers and survival in action. And then they would open the door, and they would push a cow out. And then you'd watch the tiger, and it was a very, not exactly educational. I do think things are changing all over the world, including in China. And I think it's changing largely because the same way it did here, England and other places, it's from animal welfare, actually. It's people buying dogs and cats and birds and having pets and stuff, and then starting to translate that to other animals and thinking, well, maybe I shouldn't be eating everything that walks.
You, about a year ago, because of your dedication and your hard work, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the danger that's involved in what you do, and for all these years you've been doing it. But about a year ago, you thought that you'd made an historic discovery, that there was somebody who was head of Hydra, you called it, who was rounded up. It must have felt like an incredible victory for you. Talk a little bit about who that is, how that came to be, and then bring us up to date now.
Yeah, so there's a syndicate that we called Hydra because it's like a hydra-headed dragon. Every time we thought we discovered, the head of it, there turned out to be somebody else behind that person. So we were like making a bigger and bigger pyramid with some of our our tools. IBM, who's here tonight, they gave us these tools. We'd pour data in. All of a sudden, you could see who's who in the zoo. And we finally got to a guy who was definitely very high up. I still think there's people higher than him. And it was like getting Al Capone. It was really exciting to finally see him pulled in by the police.
So who were you working with? Because in many instances, the government, the judges, the diplomats are on the take.
Yep.
In any given country, in any given town.
Yeah, so Freeland hires former law enforcement officers who have good connections within the current ranks. So in this case, we had 2 former police officers who knew who to work with in the current police force, and we carefully migrated our intel over to them, and they acted quickly, because for sure, this Al Capone, this Bunchai Bak was his name, definitely we knew he had cops on his payroll. I mean, we watched the payments in some cases happen.
So this guy gets rounded up, the Capone, and you must have been absolutely elated at that. Then what happens?
Well, to make a long story short, he goes to court, and I think at that point, you know, the whole world was watching because Freeland made sure it was like spotlighted, but unfortunately it wasn't being watched that closely locally. People didn't know who he was, and I think in retrospect, we need to do a better job at making sure all of our outreach is really localized. I thought we did that, but basically, the defense rested their case on one witness, and that witness fingered Bunchai, saying, yep, that's the guy that I was working for. And they got to him. They threatened him or paid him money or both, and he changed his story. And the case fell apart, so he went free. He's free.
He's free now.
He's free.
Back to his old ways?
I think it's like any kind of organized crime. This is family organized crime. I mean, it's extended family, you know. But I think right now he knows that he's been outed. So it's kind of dangerous for him to be playing such a pivotal role. So now the key is, it's hard, but given, again, the analytic tools, we try to figure out who's it been passed down to. You know, it's the next Corleone. And
so
then,
again, it's with the help of companies like IBM and through AI that you're able to gather all this data, right?
Yeah, well, we gather the data any way we can, but it just takes forever to look at it and analyze it. So we take these tools, and it sorts it out faster. It saves us time. It saves us a lot of time. But we need to get, you know, we need to get judges in certain countries to... This judge, I mean, I went to the court, I watched it, and they came out and they were showing these like fancy link charts, and I was like, great. And the judges were like, you know, what's that? So a little bit of sensitization there. But yeah, he walked. We were gutted.
I am amazed reading about what you've done over all these years. I'm amazed that you keep at it. Because the scope of this, the scale of it, the danger of it. I mean, you've gone and shot sort of undercover video. Are you never scared?
So there's a bunch of us who do that, and I think everybody's just so tired of this that they don't think about that. They're just hell-bent, go forward, let's get these guys and women. It's not just guys, by the way.
Right,
it's women,
right.
too.
Yeah.
We got kingpins and queenpins. My wife, who's sitting in the front here, she's done her fair bit of hidden camera work, helping us bust wildlife traders. We've got other people doing it, too. And we've got these great former law enforcement officers. When we go in, we know we've got some connections, so we don't feel alone. That's very important.
Are you feeling as though, despite Bach despite that setback, do you feel as though you are making headway? I mean, presumably, it's absolutely vital to get the story out. You know, a publication like GQ, the more that the rest of the especially here, you know, we think that maybe it's not happening here. Well, clearly it is happening here. But the more people know about it, the more people are aware of it. That's got to be, in the end, a goal.
Yeah, no, definitely. We found that, you know, that's why we're doing the film festival. We found that good storytelling moves things forward. We've worked with several police forces before where we had National Geographic come in and do some stories, and we literally documented a 300% improvement in performance with TV cameras around.
Funny how that works.
Yeah, I'm sure you know about that.
You do, a little bit.
Yeah.
So I didn't mean to skip over the human trafficking, because it's the numbers again are staggering. How does it overlap?
It does overlap sometimes. That's how we got into human trafficking in the first place. Rich talked about a Siberian tiger project we did eons ago, and one of the syndicates that we were trying to bust at that time, that was back in the 90s, they were also trafficking women to Japan. And so we found that interesting. And then we found another syndicate doing the same thing, wildlife, women, gold, and alcohol. And then we started to realize there are these like groups out there that take on illegal business, just like syndicates we know historically, and that's their business, is to come in. It's high profit margins. They fill a void. So, yeah, we find a lot of crisscross. Drug trafficking as well. So they're the ones to go to if you want to move things across the border. The box were the same. Drugs, people, gold, cars, wildlife.
And here in the U.S., who's the Bach? You don't have to name names per se, but again, organized crime?
So all I can, we know of some investigations going on. What I can tell you is that just like with drug trafficking, like I'm sure some of you have seen some of the movies and TV series, like some of those syndicates, they're here too. You know, they buy property in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They want to be in the U.S. They want to put their kids through school here. This is not just an over there thing.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's something really important that needs to be underlined. It's here too.
Yeah.
Is there any chance that is there a way to lessen the desirability of these animals being slaughtered and traded? I think some of it has to do with medicine, with food. Mm-hmm. Is there a way to attack it that way? By trying to, I don't know, inform, educate, change habits, change beliefs in what works? Yeah,
I think the world of marketing and advertising is a huge resource for us. We've had behavior change specialists and scientists come out of that world. They make a lot less money coming into the NGO community, but they may take a break from their job just to do something that they feel passionate about. So they use these incredible methods of how they sell, you know, soap and shampoo and the sixth new brand of something to us all, or consumerism, except they turn it on its head, and it's all about getting to that trigger inside. And I think what we've learned is that a lot of these animals that are being bought, whether it's a body part or live, whether it's here or over there, it's a lot of times it's about status. It's showing off. So you need to take the status away from the purchase. Mm-hmm. And the way to do that is usually not going directly to the consumer because they feel very strongly about what they're doing. It's going to influencers around them, mm-hmm. their kids, their friends, and start building up that social pressure on and around them to take that status away from the purchase. That's a long-term thing. Hopefully we can speed it up. In the meantime, the enforcement work, we're putting a finger in the dike and try to slow the decline.
you mentioned, I think, or maybe Rich mentioned, this month, in fact, the UN report that basically sounded an alarm on the species that we still have and those that are endangered. Again, the numbers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're not. We follow this every day. We were glad the UN put that out. It was. There's other reports that have been put out, but what the UN did this time is they did a good communications blast on it. It was very effective. Got into all the papers right down to the local. Everybody's heard about it, which is fantastic. That helps all of us a lot. To us, it's not a new story, but it's great to have everybody else aware of it now.
Climate change, how does that play into all of this?
The world just gets hotter without biodiversity. Very simple. I think, you know, what all this has in common is it's still more rewarding, unfortunately, to tear up the earth than it is to protect it. I think that's the bottom line here.
Economically rewarding.
Yeah. People, you know, we need to make nature protection and protection of people more rewarding for everybody. And I think you can do that. I think there's ways you can do that using technology now. And what we're starting to do is work with governments to develop restitution funds. You know, we're looking at all that money, 175 billion, 125, it's enormous. Where's all that money? You know, and NGOs are all elbowing each other and writing grants and feverishly trying to get $5,000, $40,000 grants. These guys have already stowed away billions. If we can help anti-money laundering authorities find that money, seize it, the United States does a good job at this. Like Robin Hood-ish. This is Robin Hood. It's a collective Robin Hood. And, you know, we don't do anything alone, Freeland. We work with other NGOs and the governments. There is competition on the good side of the fence. You know, everybody's struggling to get resources. So I think we've put a program together which would incentivize collaboration. So it'd be a collective Robin Hood. We'd all bring our information together, because all the stuff we're talking about now, whether you're putting a hole in the sky, trading endangered species, or slaves, it's all being done illegally, which means it's money laundering.
Right.
There's laws against that across the world. That money can be seized. The government takes a big piece, they're happy, but we should get them to put a piece of it aside for recovery, to go back into, you know, pay off the victims and also help restore the ecosystems and wildlife in communities that they've impacted. That's what we're going to be working on for a long time. That's what we're working on now. We got to speed that up. That makes our work more rewarding, and we drain the tanks of the traffickers and fill our own and roll over them.
Looking ahead to the film festival, after last year's, what sense did you come away with after going through that incredible festival?
Yeah, it was great. Hope people can come. It's fun.
Great town.
It is a great town. It's fun.
It is. It's a
Green Lake's addictive. Yeah. And not that far away. So I think, well, first of all, it went beyond our expectations. I mean, for those of you who haven't been up to Green Lake, it's population less than 1,000 people. And we had about 1,000 people there. And I can tell you most of the people were from outside. But we had folks coming in from, like, you know, Chicago, Milwaukee. We had part of our crew that produces this are Native Americans, so they brought in music. We had local farmers. Then we had folks come in from Brazil and Vietnam and India. You know, it was an interesting mix to walk around town and see that cross-section. I mean, Chicago's already international, so you might be used to that, but up there in that little cross-section of town, it's pretty interesting. I think it's a heavy subject, so we've made it more of a point this year. We're like, look, we're looking for stories that inspire, you know, that show us that there is hope for this planet and people, because there really are great people and projects out there. So I think we'll see more of that this year.
Good. It's in September, Rich? 13th to the 15th, Green Lake, Wisconsin. From here, 3 hours, door to door, basically. And it's a wonderful part of the country, a wonderful community. That lake has something, Dechola? It has something special about that lake. I think as word spreads, as more and more people become aware of the festival, and thanks to you all being here tonight, it can only help. It can only help.
Definitely. And we're still accepting films. If you know anybody who's got like short film, we accepted films last year that were 3 minutes long, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 90 minutes. So we're still accepting films.
Right.
Yeah.
Good.
For the next couple weeks or so. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, I met some tonight. Yeah. Yeah, please. Yeah, that's. What about the poachers? Sorry. Yes, there are. We don't advocate for that for a couple reasons. First of all, just personally, I'm against the death penalty, so I think that's essentially meting out the death penalty. Also, you get two kinds of poachers. Well, three really. One's the poor poacher who's doing subsistence, and we've hired some of them. They've worked for Freeland and tell us things that we would have never known. Awesome data, intel. And then they become outreach workers and try to convince other people. We give them alternative livelihoods. We haven't talked about that tonight, but we have a whole farm program where we, convert poachers to protectors. Then you get another kind, which is kind of hardened. There are really sort of two groups, really. That group and the other group is, well-armed. They're not going to be converted. They're in there to do a job. They're making probably more money than we think. But even them, I think, there are shoot-to-kill policies in some countries. And so we don't make those policies. But I think what we really want to do, what we're trying to do is freeze the trigger. The trigger won't be pulled without the money. So we find the money. We find who's the financier. And the nice thing with anti-money laundering law is if I suspect you or your company of acquiring mysterious wealth from trafficking, if it's compelling enough to the anti-money laundering authorities, they can freeze your account and open up a case and take a closer look. And then if they find, in fact, it is trafficking, they can seize it. And that's where we want to get in and play more in that sandbox. And as I said, drain the tanks of the traffickers and fill the counter-trafficking community's tank, the war chest.
Hey, that's how they got the phone. You got to follow the money.
They got him because of his taxes.
That's right.
Right? And hardly anybody still does that. It's amazing. But that's the best way. Yes, the U.S. government has made counter-wildlife trafficking, or CWT as they call it, everything's an acronym, a Tier 1 issue. So they put it right up there on the same level with terrorism. So the U.S. government has been pumping out money and speeches and all kinds of stuff just in the last few years. Yeah. Oh yeah, I just came from West Africa and we were literally up in a park called Park W. It's got cheetahs, the last population of western lions in Africa, huge population of elephants, and they were getting hit by insurgent groups from Burkina Faso. Those were, yeah, ISIS-related. So they're killing to sell. They got to fund their war. All insurgent groups have the potential of doing that kind of thing. In Thailand, Boon Chai Bak was going down to the southern border with Malaysia and doing business with Muslim insurgents to get pangolins and other things. They knew they needed their cooperation to move things across the border. Yes, Matt.
Hey, Steve. I know that there is a recent corporate consciousness effort that they call sustainability. It's become, a platform of a lot of large corporations. Maybe not so much in the U.S., but I work for a European bank. Very important to them. Just wondering, is that more lip service, or are you actually seeing some of that lead to changes?
A good question. I'm wondering the same thing still myself. I don't want to assume anything because we haven't knocked on all the doors yet. But one thing we have started to do is, we want all this data to come in to fuel our cases. Is that me? And everything we do is driven by data. And one thing we've found is the corporations out there, they become more interested when they realize that we've got a lot of data. And so I don't mind that. It's win-win. And we're even getting into tokenizing data now, using blockchain, non-blockchain technology to facilitate transfers from our tipsters to us, and then we can reward them with a digital token, cryptocurrency, which they can redeem with stuff that the corporations give us. So when the corporations give us support, they don't just write a big check, take a picture and say, here's $40,000. That actually becomes tokenized, and the tokens get released based on performance. So if a ranger or a villager reports or stops poaching, boom, they get a token. So it's performance-based. Corporations like that. They're starting, especially in Asia, they're getting into that. Over in Africa too, because Africa was like, Kenya was way out in front of all countries and doing, digital currencies basically on phones years ago. So we're toying with that too, and that's our sort of inroads to corporations right now, is showing them return on their investment and the data. I'll repeat your question so everybody knows. You want to know what can everybody do? Yeah, sure. There's plenty. I mean, first of all, be an aware consumer. I mean, there's such good information now already, not just from us, but many organizations on what you should and shouldn't be buying with regard to wildlife or animals or animal parts. On the human trafficking side, there's very good information about which corporations have a clean supply chain. I think that's really important. And now that they are doing their due diligence not to buy, their cotton products or whatever from slaves. I mean, there's a lot of that going on. And some companies are spending the time and money to make sure their supply chains are clean. You could, you send a big message, this is all about the money, to your companies by buying or not buying, and based on that. There's plenty of good competition out there. So I think we need to be rewarding the companies that budget for that and do it.
And how do we find out who that is? Which companies? How do we go about, as consumers, finding out which companies are clean? I mean, that would be really satisfying, I think, if we knew who we should and who we shouldn't patronize and feel like you're actually doing something.
So on the wildlife stuff, it's easy. You can like literally Google. There's so much information out there now that people have done it. But on human trafficking, I would give a plug for another organization that's done a great job on this. They're called the Mekong Club. And if you go to their website, like the M-E-K-O-N-G, Mekong Club, they're our partner. That's their strength. We do the law enforcement training. They do the corporate engagement on human trafficking. We team up and do some trainings as well. But yeah, thankfully there's great data right on the web right now. If you go to the right resource, I would recommend them. You could see from Rich's very good video, by the way, I hadn't seen that before, of the festival, it's pretty broad. So, you know, it's all about stories about vulnerable people, wildlife, and ecosystems that are overcoming or at least trying to buck the exploitation. So it could be, you know, it could be investigative. The main thing is it should be, there's an attempt to come back. It's about recovery. Even if they're like, yeah, even if they're not there yet, we want to know about that. It's all about recovery. Yeah, well, I mean, thankfully there are amazing stories out there. Victims who have survived human trafficking or groups that have gone in and intervened and helped. Last year we watched a film about, you know, Nepalese kids who had been trafficked into the circus trade, which I didn't even know about. They got rescued, and then they were like, well, what are we going to do now? You know, we're circus workers. It was a really honest portrayal, and eventually they created a circus in Kathmandu. They stayed circus workers, and they traveled the country teaching people about human trafficking. It was like, it's a really genuine, you know, this is not Spielberg fictional stuff. This is like real. So I think that did leave people with a sense of hope. Yeah. Yeah, so the issues we want to capture are global. So we had plenty of films that were submitted, some were by Rich, about the health of the lake ecosystem and what was going on with the soil from the farms nearby. Farmers that were trying to change their practices for the long run to make more money and produce better food versus those that were having a hard time converting. And they're the same stories we hear over in Uganda and in Thailand. I mean, that's beautiful when you bring in stories like that and you actually have folks listening to each other and learning from each other. It's thinking it's different, but it's more similar than we realize.
I'm kind of interested in hearing your thoughts and your actions as they differ between the exploitation of human trafficking versus the wildlife trafficking. Because, I mean, I see them as very different things, and status is attributed to the wildlife trafficking, and I doubt status is attributed to the human trafficking. And then a corollary to that is, where are you seeing the engagement from a citizen's perspective versus a corporate perspective? Because I think, you know, it's tough for corporations to rely on cheap labor to get tied up in human trafficking concerns, because they have to be honest and transparent, right? So maybe easier for them to get on the wildlife exploitation. But I mean, I see them as greatly different issues, and I'm trying to figure out how you guys see the commonality.
Yeah, no, there are differences, obviously. I mean, the commonalities are organized crime and corruption, and then if you get down into the weeds, trafficking routes, some of the same people, and then the drivers are, you know, profit margins. But you're right, it's not about status so much, not nearly as much anyway, in the human trafficking field. I mean, it could be, there's a sliver of that in the sex trafficking, which is somewhat status, but a lot of trafficking is about agriculture, fishing, domestic servitude, that kind of thing. I guess your question is, what are we asking people to do about human trafficking?
Where are you seeing your best traction? You know, I mean, as people here, we can help promote your story.
Yeah.
And your effort.
Yeah. The best practices, I think, are corporations that do their due diligence, and then organizations that, you know, constructively engage and recruit former victims who help them figure this out, so that we're not just looking at it from the outside. You know, whether it's a Cambodian man and his son who spent 2 years on a fishing boat, nearly got killed, never got paid, or a Burmese girl who ended up in a brothel when she thought she was going to work as a seamstress. Those voices tend to get lost. They tend to get re-trafficked, or they are shamed and go back. What we've been doing is protecting their identity and making sure that when the traffickers are caught, money goes back into the victims' pockets and helps them repatriate. We don't do that alone. We do it with law enforcement and some other NGOs that specialize in taking care of the victims. So the biggest difference that we find from our frontline work is it's one thing to stop a truck or a cargo of a whole bunch of animals or tusks or whatever. When you help with a rescue mission of people, there's a lot more work, and it's much more complicated to take care of them because they've got needs, they're scared, they're worried about the cops being corrupt, etc. So the NGO, like us and our partners, play a very important role to make sure that the police and other agencies take a victim-centric approach. We've seen it so often where people go in and do raids on, you know, a factory or a brothel, and they just scare the hell out of the victims, and sometimes they even arrest them because they're there working illegally. So I think, you know, everybody can, this question came up today at the high school, or preparatory college. And it's tough. It's tough. Recognizing human trafficking is really, really hard, which is why we look at the money side of things. And we get information from the victims, and then we will follow that trail to the people in the syndicate, and then try to do quiet rescues of victims, get them out of the trade without busting down doors, so nobody even knows that they were, like, we could buy them out, for example. They provide information, then we use that information to go in and find the money. I can just tell you, that's what we do. That's what we do.
Where do you get your funding?
Historically, we used to get our funding from a variety of sources, from like some private foundations, and then the U.S. government got interested in us, and we started getting a lot of funding from U.S. government agencies. And now we've never really had an individual donor base. We grew organically. It was just one of us, then two, then three, and we never grew a fundraising arm. So we've been surviving on grants all these years. So, you know, one of the reasons we're doing this event is we're trying to spread the word. We are trying to cultivate, you know, an individual donor base. I was out in LA, in Aspen. We've been trying to tell our story to people and, you know, make more friends.